Hello, my name is Rick Houston, and welcome to another episode of the Moonshine and Motorsports podcast. From bootlegging to prohibition and Charlotte's first illegal speakeasy to secrets buried for years, and finally to Ava Gardner, the story of the Seven Jars Distillery in Charlotte is truly something to behold. So enjoy this conversation with Scott McClure, the managing partner at Seven Jars, its master distiller, and he's also an epic storyteller. All right, well, first of all, Scott, where do you fit into the Seven Jars story? What's your relationship to the original family, if you have one?
No, absolutely. I'm married into the family. Like most men, I'm married up. I married Frank Ratcliffe's daughter, Velda.
Okay.
And we've been married 29 years now. And we started Seven Jars Distillery about 10 years ago.
Okay, all right. So from what I've been able to gather, Frank was a pretty interesting fella. Now, did you know him before he passed, I would assume?
As a teenager, we sort of knew of each other, meaning the families knew of each other. Charlotte used to be a much, much smaller town. My father was a truck driver and a teamster. Their offices were on North Tryon Street. Frank Ratcliffe operated multiple businesses on North Tryon Street, and their family farm was only about 3 miles from where the Teamsters building was located. So I'm fairly certain they all knew each other.
Right. So in his early days, he was evidently a really interesting character.
Well, he really was. My mother-in-law, Velma, wanted the company originally, Seven Jars, to be called Southern Rogue because she saw her husband as being very much a Rhett Butler sort of character. Subsequently, we found out that the Southern Rogue is actually the name of a distillery in Southern California. That's when my nephew Jeremy said, well, why don't we call it Seven Jars? And it sort of germinated with us, and today that's where we are 10 years later. But yeah, Frank was a very interesting fellow for his time. He spent the first 30-some years of his life not only as a bootlegger and a gambler, but looking for business anywhere he can find it. He and Velma were both Depression-era children, and those were special kinds of Americans. We started Seven Jars as much as a business enterprise, as much as a memory to the life of Frank and Velma as we could. Velma would come to Charlotte in 1950 to sing in a club that Frank had built in downtown Charlotte where Discovery Place is today. The club on the ground floor was called the House of Steaks. Dollar fillets, 25-cent shrimp cocktails. I mean, these are the days. Velma came to Charlotte to sing there at the club. 2 weeks later, they were married.
2 weeks?
Oh, yeah.
All right, Frank.
Well, when you see what you like, you go for it. And he told his friends at the club the very first night she was there, boys, I'm not letting this one leave Charlotte. 2 weeks later, they were married.
Awesome. Now, you talked about him being a bootlegger. How far and wide did he go in his distribution network?
Yeah, so Frank's father, Tom Ratcliffe, originally had a farm on what is today Highland Creek Golf Course. Very nice community, about 8,000 homes around it. Highland Creek is 3 or 4 miles from the Speedway. But Tom was a local moonshiner. We were an agriculture community. It was, frankly, easier to distribute a gallon of corn liquor than it was a 50-pound sack of grain. Everybody had corn. But Tom would have his still, and Tom would use his 3 sons to deliver his liquor, making them the bootleggers. Well, Frank was always more entrepreneurial than his brothers, and pretty soon he would start running Moonshine from some of history's characters that I know your audience is very familiar with. He was good friends with Junior Johnson. He was great friends with Lee Petty, and would come to run liquor for them. As NASCAR became more and more popular, they were spending less time on their liquor business, and Frank sort of filled in a gap, bringing liquor to downtown Charlotte. The club was such an attraction in downtown Charlotte that Police Chief Littlejohn would position a cop on the corner of 6th and North Tryon Street, right there where the club was, Discovery Place today. And we're a world-class city. You don't want visitors just milling around downtown looking for illegal booze. The cop would direct them to the bloating dock of the club where they could go and pick up their illegal liquor. It was a community service we were providing. Yeah. In addition to that, Charlotte used to be a much larger military town. The Camp Green Street area was a basic training base for the military. Frank would supply liquor to the officers. That word would trickle down to the enlisted troops. It was just another business development idea to further his enterprise.
Now, you talked about the club, and this was during Prohibition. So this would have been what I guess they would call in the movies a speakeasy.
This was the original Charlotte Speakeasy. Okay. And because North Carolina used to be, before Prohibition, the largest wine industry in North America, it was coincidentally the best place to have that type of business. And back to Police Chief Littlejohn, he was the longest running police chief in the city of Charlotte. And the thing that makes this story really unique, we've always had friends in law enforcement. Today, a good friend of mine is our current police chief, John Jennings. But one of the things that makes Littlejohn so interesting is in Littlejohn's day, they had to re-elect the sheriff every 2 years. Today, our police chief's appointed by the city council. But in Littlejohn's day, he had to get reelected every 2 years, and he was not going to bust up the one club where everybody he needed to get reelected, the business leaders, essentially the Chamber of Commerce of the day, was always at the club. Judges, lawyers, everybody else involved there too. The ground floor was called the House of Steaks, and the second floor was a full-blown casino. Craps tables, dealers, machines, the whole 9 yards.
How did he and Velma met? You talked earlier about she came to sing.
So Velma had started out in Kansas City. That's where she was born. And then completely on her own, at the age of 17, she went all the way out to Los Angeles and started singing for club managers out there, the idea of being discovered. She became extremely popular. They networked all over Los Angeles. She would eventually get gigs around the country, several months in Pittsburgh, several months in Chicago, nearly 2 years in New York City. Started working her way down the East Coast, was booked to sing in Frank's nightclub for 2 weeks. And that's where she ended up meeting Frank. But Velma was a very special character. She could sing in 8 different languages. In Velma's day, the motion picture studios would release a movie with a long play record that gave you the musical background, the scores for the shows. Well, she learned to sing from all these stars that had been that made these movies in different countries. So the actress Ava Gardner, for example, was someone who was very much in Velma and Frank's wheelhouse. That was somebody they could relate to. But she could sing, like I said, in 8 different languages. And here's something that you may want to edit out if I've made a clean enough break there. I'm the only man I'll bet you've ever met who took 3 women on his honeymoon with him.
I don't know if that's a good or bad thing.
My little wife next door, Velma's daughter, crashes every night about 7:30, 8 o'clock. me and Velma in the casino till 4 in the morning. She was so much fun. And not a lot of men have that kind of relationship with their mother-in-law, but I was very blessed. So.
Awesome. Now, at what point did the Speakeasy start graduating into a more legal operation?
Well, it never really did. In 1947, North Carolina would create the ABC system. At the end of Prohibition, all Congress really did was they put the issue of liquor back on the individual states. And each state got to its own liquor laws at different points in time. Here at Seven Jars, we give public tours, and everybody from all parts we're only about 3 miles from the airport. People come in from all parts of the country and give us stuff like, your liquor laws are so backwards in North Carolina and this sort of thing. Well, be careful. I'm 8 generations here in Mecklenburg County. But when they leave here, they understand how that came to be. North Carolina finally created the ABC system in 1947. South Carolina, coincidentally, about the same point in time. And so starting into 1947 and going into 1950, a fellow by the name of Henry Sievers was the very first director of the ABC system here in Mecklenburg County, another one of Frank's friends. Mr. Sievers would create the ABC system. Velma would come to Charlotte in 1950, started singing at the club. But one of the unique things that happened about our story was that times were different for men and women in 1950, and Frank would sit down with Velma and say, now, I've been in these clubs for the last so many years, and I know what happens in these clubs late at night. No wife of mine is going to be in these clubs. You can continue to sing in church as long as it doesn't get out of hand, but your club singing days are over. And Velma, very independent, but in the privacy of their own home, she would say, well, I've been in these clubs too. And if you want me to be your good little wife and stay out of the clubs and take care of your family and cook your meals and all those kinds of things, you're going to come home every night and be a proper husband. And so I really think there was an agreement of sorts between the two of them that Frank needed to get completely legal, get out of all these illegal businesses. And as self-righteous as it sounds, this was very much a Godfather kind of story. If you remember the Al Pacino line, I'm trying to get out, but they keep pulling me back in. Well, at this point, Frank had over 300 people working for him here in Charlotte in all of these off-color sort of businesses. And getting out with people relying on you for their income was just something that wasn't real easy to do. So it would take a couple of years. There was a period of time where he had the opportunity to own a silver mine in Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix, Arizona is very close to Las Vegas. There's a whole chapter of our story that revolves around that. But eventually would come back to Charlotte, buy a farm, tried to farm for a couple of years, this too on North Trine Street at what is today North Trine and Harris Boulevard. Frank didn't really care for farming, and he would eventually turn that farm into a golf course. Today, our family is partnered in a business that manages over 22 golf courses here in the Carolinas.
So that's the business that he eventually got into, golf courses?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it really wasn't that much of a stretch, because even today, there are men and women who gamble on the golf courses. Frank loved to gamble. We're a family that still likes to vacation together. We have a shot glass collection that belonged to Velma. And you'll notice real quickly from the shot glasses that we only vacation in towns with horse tracks and casinos. I don't know why, but that's just our thing.
Yeah.
And so that transition really was fairly simple, and it gave Frank and Velma a grounding, if you will, of how Frank could come on and be a legitimate businessman. In addition to the golf courses, he started doing real estate. 90% of the real estate between downtown Charlotte and the Speedway today, Frank had his fingerprint on in some way, shape, or form, including all of the business on North Tryon Street, the area that we popularly call in Charlotte today Noda. Frank had some involvement in.
Wow. When did he pass away,
Frank passed in 1977.
Okay, all right. And speaking of the golf courses, I understand that somebody somewhere eventually went digging on one of the golf courses for this, I guess, what amounted to a hidden treasure.
Yeah, so Frank and Velma would have 3 children. Frank built this golf course in the university area that was called Paradise Valley, and Frank put their home in the middle of the golf course. 1975, Frank and Velma have been married for 25 years, completely legal, completely legitimate. Frank would go to Velma and said, I buried something out on the golf course that I think will help you and the children if times ever get bad again, and I'm not here to take care of you. The notion from that period of time is a lot of people from the Depression era believed the Depression would eventually come back. It's so funny to me. I also have a real estate business, and people say to me all the time, well, 2008 was bad. Yeah. 2009 was horrible. We don't know bad in this country. The Depression era people really had it going on. And Frank believed, and others, that they had secrets that they wanted to pass on. Burying something was very, very common in those days. At my house today, I have something buried for my children. It's just a way of doing things.
What have you got buried?
Frank would pass away suddenly in 1977. The family was devastated. And in dealing with all that, at that same point in time, 2 things happened in downtown Charlotte. Frank was already negotiating to sell the old club location to the city of Charlotte for Discovery Place. City Council would meet one night, decide to condemn the property. A politician by the name of Liz Hare was good friends with Frank and Velma. She called Velma up and said, look, I understand you're grieving Frank, but this is what the city council's going to do. Velma got right in her car. My brother-in-law Dale drove her downtown. She went before the city council and she said, the government allows you to do what you're trying to do to me. But she reached into her pocketbook and pulled out a letter of intent from the city of Charlotte where they had offered Frank much more money for the property than they were trying to condemn it for. And she looked at him and she said, but this little widow's going to make it ugly for you. Subsequently, weeks later, they renegotiated the whole deal and she got a fair market value for the Discovery Place property. The second thing that happened in that same period of time, Charlotte was growing. Charlotte would annex that part of North Tryon Street that contained the golf course, and the property taxes would double, and the family had to look at selling off the golf course in order to pay the property taxes. Well, my brother-in-law Dale was 18 at that point. He was running the golf course for his mother in lieu of his father passing. And Dale would go to his mother and say, we need to find what Daddy buried before we sell the property and lose it forever. Velma said, that's fine, but Frank used to have some very nasty characters. And if the word gets out that they're trying to dig up his secrets, those people will circle back around. I've been shy of them for 25 years. I don't want anything to do with them. She would only let Dale go out and look for this thing, whatever it was, late at night. Not that on North Tryon Street, a little lady with a flashlight and a kid with a shovel wouldn't draw some attention, but it was a different time then. Finally, after multiple weeks of looking, she had some general directions, but not very specific, about where this thing was. It came time to sell the property. And Dale said, Mama, I've just got to find this thing that Daddy buried. I'm going to take my backhoe, a tractor with a big bucket on the front of it. And I'm going to dig up every part of this golf course if I have to. And if anybody asks, we're just getting soil samples for the people who are going to buy the property. And subsequently, he went about tearing up the golf course. But Velma would still only let him go out late at night. Well, all of our bottles today on both our winery products and our distilled spirits say sometimes you got to dig a little deeper. Dale went back to the original spot that they thought this thing had been buried in, went down about 4.5 feet, and out rolled 7 mason jars wrapped in aluminum foil, hence the name Seven Jars.
What was in the 7 jars?
Well, now, listen, you
Moonshine
and Motorsports, y'all got a heavy following. I've checked you out, but we don't talk a lot about what was in the jars. It is our belief that families deserve a certain level of secrets. However, because I realize you're a drive at 'em journalist and all that.
Yeah.
Plus, I want to keep everybody in motorsports happy with us. We know about y'all's background. But one of the things that was in the jars was recipes from some of the old timers. If you couldn't pay what Frank called his transportation cost, then he would simply take your recipes. And I never knew anybody to tell him no, certainly not twice. And everything that we make here today is produced, now certainly with more modern equipment, cleaner yeast strains, fresher grains, all of those things. But the recipes all came from the jars. And then one other thing that you might find interesting, your audience, there was what we called a cheat sheet. There was a piece of paper that down the left-hand side had the names of cards, king, queen, jack, so forth. And then on the right-hand side were code words for each one of those cards. And so we were all sitting around a poker table, and Velma's job was to circle around the table and bring us smokes, drinks, sandwiches, whatever it took to keep us playing cards longer. And she would get around behind you, sir, and she would glance over at Frank and say, Frank, do you remember the time those cows got out and we chased them for 3 hours and never could get them back to the barn? Once we quit chasing them, they all just walked right back in pretty as you please. Well, that was to telegraph to Frank exactly the cards you were holding in your hand because they both had the code. That way, Frank would be able to play whatever hand he wanted to.
You didn't say what you had buried for your kids at your house. You just kind of skipped right over that.
There's some things. There's some things. I've taught my kids all they know. I haven't taught them all I know.
Okay. All right. Good deal. At what point did planning start for 7 Jars?
Well, Frank, this goes back to Frank. Frank had always said in his day, distilleries, there were only 14 of them in the entire country, and it was millions of dollars to open a distillery. And Frank really believed, and it was part of his business acumen that he could project this far into the future, that one day the government would make it easier, certainly less expensive, for craft distilleries to open up. Too many people had been doing it before then by themselves around North Carolina and other places. We started seeing in the early 90s, late 80s, the expansion of craft breweries. And my brother-in-law had made a fine living in the golf industry. I came from hospitality and a food background. My wife had had an excellent career in banking here in Charlotte. And we were all getting to the point where it was time to consider slowing down, but that's not really our way. And so we started seeing the expansion of the craft breweries and started checking into the laws and find out, well, North Carolina does have craft distilleries opening up, and there are ways, people out there who are finding the ways to do it. So we launched on this adventure. 10 years later, we are the only craft distillery in North Carolina that I know that currently operates a winery as well. We have 7 spirits, 17 wines, and 7 beers. If you pick up on a theme there. We are people that believe very much in the luck of sevens. My wife went down to Aruba. We went down to Aruba a couple of years ago, and she picked up 4 sevens as soon as we walked into the casino on a game called Caribbean Stud. That had a nice little payoff, paid for the trip. So we started looking into, we are the only North Carolina distillery that not only opens a winery and a distillery, but in the last 10 years we have shipped to 5 different countries, and last year 45 different states.
Wow.
So we've been just incredibly blessed, but I really think the entire blessing goes back to the legacy of Frank and Velma and what they left us to expand on.
Now, what is a craft distillery?
So a craft distillery is really, technical terms, is a group that's doing less than 10,000 barrels a year. So you can imagine a Jim Beam, a Jack Daniels, those guys. And we have, I was sharing with someone earlier this morning that the thing that's so exciting about the liquor industry, I came from a time in real estate where if another real estate agent could squirrel your deal in some way, there was a commission to be paid for doing that. In the distillery business, every competitor, large and small, I can pick up the phone today and reach out to Bill Samuels at Maker's Mark. Freddie No at Jim Beam has helped us out in several different ways. But just as true, the brotherhood and sisterhood of craft distilleries here in North Carolina, we're always exchanging information and partnering together on different things, because whatever any one of us is going through at the time, we've either already been through it or we're going to go through it. And so it's just smart to pull information from all of those guys. But a craft guy is someone that works obviously in smaller batches, fewer barrels. One of our products today is a collaboration we do with the Ava Gardner Family Trust out in Smithfield, North Carolina. Ava was very much a bourbon girl, married to Sinatra. She would go out and Copacabana and different clubs with Frank, and Frank would try and order some foo-foo drink for her. And she said, if I can't drink the same bourbon you're drinking, I'm not going to drink at all. They were, one of the reasons they didn't last very long, 3-4 years, was that both of their personalities just conflicted with each other because they were both so outgoing and dynamic people. But that's been our biggest success to date. 102 proof, 7-year bourbon. It's a premium bourbon, but it's not that expensive compared to other bourbons that are out there. Quite frankly, my go-to is Buffalo Trace after the Ava Gardner, right? I'm not a big fan of Blanton's. They're procedures that, and everybody's palate's different. I'm not slighting Blanton's or the Buffalo Trace people at all, but everybody has a different palate, which is the best. A good friend of mine, Charles Wilkerson at Whiskey Tango Charlie, says, what's your favorite bourbon? The next one. That's what I want to live for.
Now, I don't exactly know how you transition from Ava Gardner to Drunk Hogs. But I couldn't not ask about the photo that you have out front in the lobby about the Drunk Hogs. What's the connection to Seven Jars there?
So the Drunk Hog story is a story that's been passed on by great storytellers, particularly here in the South, for years. Lo and behold, we found out that it actually started with our family. When we launched Seven Jars Distillery, there were a lot of stories that we had heard over the years, but we really didn't have any credible evidence to, which is one of the miracles of Seven Jars. We can actually document through old archives of the Charlotte Observer every story that we tell here. And we hired a guy by the name of Harry Hoover, who was a former crime reporter for the Observer, to go out and do the research. And he came back with all these stories. The Drunk Hog story originated with Tom Ratcliffe, my wife's grandfather. When he had the farm out at Highland Creek, he raised hogs, and he was a moonshiner. Then Police Chief Vic Fesperman, we've always had friends in law enforcement, it would get back to Tom that Fesperman was coming out to raid his still. But downtown Charlotte used to be a long way from Highland Creek Golf Course, and it would actually give him about 24 hours notice that the cops were coming. That gave Tom enough time to get his still on the back of a Model A truck and get it off the farm, but he had 12 barrels of fermented mash that he couldn't figure out. A fermented mash is about 20% alcohol already. Couldn't figure out what to do with them. We didn't have forklifts or anything like that. So he shoved those barrels over into the hog trough. The next day, Fesperman and all the cops came out. And Fesperman was so angry because he knew somebody had tipped Tom off. First off, there was no doubt Tom was a moonshiner because in those days you could have liquor in a pint bottle with a doctor's prescription. Well, they kept catching Tom with 5-gallon buckets, so they knew he was a moonshiner. Fesperman was so angry that somebody had tipped Tom off, they arrested Tom for having drunk hogs. Which really wasn't a crime, maybe animal cruelty, but it really wasn't a crime. Fesperman was just trying to throw his weight around, and they arrested Tom for that. And the fine, if I recall correctly, was like $5,000. Well, in the 1930s, $5,000 was a lot of money, and that was the story of the drunk hog story that's been passed around by Southern storytellers for decades originated right on Tom's farm.
All right, so last question. What would Frank and Velma think of this place today?
Well, we hope they'd be very proud. I mentioned that my father was a Teamsters boss, and there's not much time that goes around that we talk about the fact that our fathers couldn't do business today. There are actually laws against things that we used to do, fairly commonplace. But they couldn't do business today given all the changes in society. But we hope Frank and Velma would be proud of us because, again, our core is trying to honor their memory, trying to honor the love affair between Frank and Velma. Frank had been a player. He had been in these clubs with all this action, all this gambling, drinking, women. But when he met Velma, he would never look at another woman again. After Frank passed away, Velma would never so much as ride in a car with a single man again. She just didn't think it was proper. And you don't find that kind of love affair and commitment very often in today's society. And it's something we long for. We miss them every day. And this has been the greatest psychological experiment for us, just to deal with their passing and keeping their memory alive. So we hope they'd be proud. We didn't really talk about tax-paid liquor. So bootlegging for a period of time, late 30s, was very much a part of but Frank's real piece of business was running liquor so Florida was one of the first states, Georgia after that, Virginia after that, to pass prohibition. Frank would go to those states and legally buy the liquor where the taxes had been paid on it and bring it back to Charlotte. That was the illegal part, bringing liquor across state lines. Tax-paid liquor was a very important chapter, and that was before Velma, but after the moonshining. The reason I have some of these stories is that we're a Southern family. We still travel together. Everybody else would party late at night in the family, but Velma had to get up and eat breakfast every morning. I'm a Southern boy. I've got to have grits every breakfast. And I was the only one that would get up and go to breakfast with her. Well, I learned all these stories that we had just kind of joked about here and there, but because there was nobody else to talk to, she told me all these stories over breakfast. One of them was that she and Frank were walking through so Las Vegas is only about 3 hours south of Phoenix. She and Frank were walking through the casino. They see a poster for Elvis Presley. This would have been about 1952. And Elvis just getting started. And Frank hired a lot of entertainers, but he really didn't follow entertainment. Today, we look back at it, well, of course he knew Elvis Presley, but he really wasn't that familiar with him. Velma, being an entertainer, was very flamboyant, very outgoing. And she would look at Frank and she said, well, I would love to see him, but we'll never get tickets. The concert's at 8 o'clock tonight. I'm sure they're sold out. Frank goes right over to the pit boss, talks to him for a minute, comes back. 3 hours later, they're on the front row of the Flamingo Auditorium with an Elvis Presley concert. And if you followed Elvis, one of the things he rarely did because of security was come off the stage during a concert, even in the early days. But that night, he walked right off the stage, came down to their table, shook Frank's hand, kissed Velma on the cheek, and said, if you good folks need anything at all while you're here in Las Vegas, let me know, and we'll have somebody take care of it. And I only like telling people that because Frank and Velma didn't throw a lot of money around. They weren't extravagant. They were quiet people. Now, Velma was an entertainer. She was very flamboyant. But they weren't throwing, people were just drawn to them. It was if I know these people kind of a thing, and everybody wanted to be involved with them. And again, much like the love affair between Frank and Velma, the attraction that Frank had as a business entity is something that you rarely, I would compare Frank to I saw one of your podcasts recently with Mr. Kelly. People would compare him to Mr. Kelly, to Hugh McCall, people like that.
Yeah. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Scott. So what do you think? What were those 7 secrets in those 7 jars that had been buried for so long? Let us know down in the comment. Now be sure to like and subscribe and comment, and we will be back soon with another great episode.